All right, good afternoon, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, August 1st, and I just feel like everything's falling apart right now. Is it all falling apart?
We're doing fine here. You mean in your life, or are we talking about the world?
Yeah, well, I think the main thing that I feel like is falling apart now is the whole Israel story amongst the
Uh-huh.
Americans' populace. I don't know if you saw
Yeah.
Tucker Carlson, but he's had two big guests on recently. One was John Mearsheimer, and the other one was this
Hmm.
Tony Aguilar guy. And they were both
Okay.
very, very powerful, very, very damning for the
Right.
Israeli state. And I think just the dam is broken. I mean, and just, the
Hmm.
genocide and the starvation is just, this is the most awful thing that crime against humanity you can commit. And then you have
Hmm.
this, but then you also have the Epstein thing, and then you have Trump just tweeting things that are so obviously Israeli first, like, Canada is looking at recognizing a Palestinian state. Well, and it's going to be hard to get a trade deal. And we're
Hmm.
seeing all these Western countries starting to realize something we talked about before, that they're going to have to ask the question, we're going to be on the wrong side of history on this. Once the evidence has become too damning that what is being
Hmm.
done here is a genocide, or at the very least, extreme war crimes. But the
Hmm.
U.S. is not budging. But
Right.
everybody's aware of it now, and that just so that's the main thing. And then of course we got Russia, we got Iran, and I'm afraid that things are going to start back with Iran once things get too crazy with Israel, because that's where it's at. I feel like we're getting towards a breaking point, but maybe
Right.
not. What do you think?
Um, well, yeah, I guess on the question of whether the dam is breaking, yeah, there are. I think we mentioned, there, we're hearing from people. We're hearing condemnations of the genocide, on the right. We've heard it on the left for a while, and again, the base on the Democratic side of the spectrum has been very strongly pro-Palestine and very anti-Israel, anti-Zionist for a while now. And then it was really what the only popular base that the Zionists have had in this country. Of course, they control the elites. The establishment is entirely Zionist, but when you look at the general population, it's been on the right. That's where Zionist power is still very solidly entrenched in this country. So these recent, you can call them breakthroughs or cracks in the dam, are very significant because we see them happening on the right. Again, most of the viewers of Tucker Carlson shows consider themselves to be conservatives. Probably most, the great majority are Republicans, and um, yeah, it's not just one guest, but now recently two guests. We had Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and called it a genocide, and she's one of the very first in the Congress to do it.
The
Bernie
first, I
Sanders
think,
hasn't. Maybe the first. Okay, very good point.
or the
Yeah,
only
Bernie
one, right? Has
Sanders.
anybody else? Has anybody else said genocide?
Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone else has. Yeah, if someone else has, maybe Tlaib or one of these, people with actual Muslims within the Congress may have, but I'm not sure that they have. She's certainly the first on the Republican side and one of the very first all around. For example, Bernie Sanders hasn't. So yeah, this really means something. And we do see that governments around the world are feeling the pressure. So one government after another, Western government, longtime supporters of Israel, are now saying that they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Now, I think, again, that's symbolic, and it doesn't um, indicate a substantive change of policy. I think it'll really mean something when they say, okay, no more arms, no more funds, a boycott of Israel, something like that. We're not seeing that, with the exception of Slovenia. I just saw that it was one European country that announced. He said, "Okay, we're not going to wait for the EU because they're not doing anything. We're declaring like an arms embargo. I don't know how many arms Slovenia can send Israel, but it's something. This is again, in general, the policy isn't changed. The U.S. administration is not doing anything different. And all the, the big European powers, whether we're talking about Germany especially, but France. Okay, of course, Macron says they went ahead and recognized the Palestinian state. Starmer says he'll do it in September. Again, that's symbolic. It shows they're feeling the pressure, but still, the establishment's the establishment. They're not abandoning the Zionists yet. But I have to say that I'm encouraged. This is, we've been saying like, why? How could this happen? And and this shows, that the horror is starting to seep through, and we're still a long way from real change. From a real end to this genocide. But it's clear that the pressure is there. And the pressure you see even in Israel. I think, I mentioned there was a major anti-war rally, even though that anti-war rally was really about the hostages. But there were people there that were trying to penetrate and crying shame because the speakers weren't addressing Palestinian suffering. But there have been smaller, rallies within Israel that actually do address Palestinian suffering. So even within Israel, there's something getting through. Again, like if you look at the numbers, it may be very, very small, but where there is nothing, there's something. And so you have to be encouraged. I haven't seen anything on, a recent poll on attitudes towards Israel. Well, no, I guess I have. But I would be curious, like a week or 2 weeks from now, maybe we'll see a difference. There is a shift, and we're seeing it even on the right side of the spectrum. Among younger Republicans, I think the majority of them does not approve of the Israeli of the war on Gaza. And so, yeah, all in all, these are hopeful signs. Unfortunately, this is happening outside of the power structures. The power structure remains firmly Zionist, but even that power structure is feeling the heat, and that's why we're getting some of these statements. Like the recognition of the state of Palestine, for example.
Well, as this situation, the sentiment towards Israel begins to become more and more negative, and I think it's happening at an accelerating rate now. People can't ignore the situation here, and I think it's becoming more and more apparent that what Israel's doing is just absolutely unacceptable. As that dam breaks, what is the result of that? What happens when the dam breaks? What does that mean? Okay, if everybody's aware, everybody is against Israel, everybody is agreeing that what Israel's doing is genocide or mass murder, deliberate starvation. If the whole world is aware of that and comes to that conclusion, but we still have, our government that still supports Israel, yeah. What happens? What does that mean?
Right. Well, it will be just a continuation of what we've seen. I mean, the U.S. has become increasingly isolated. They've had their firm allies in the West, but those firm allies are beginning to waver. Let's just put it that way. They haven't bolted. They haven't gone over to the other side. But the U.S. administration and the Israeli government, they're clearly displeased by, these moves to recognize the state of Palestine. But it does mean increasing diplomatic isolation, to say, well, who cares, as long as the U.S. administration is supporting us. But then, yeah, the big question is, like, I think that's what the Israelis, that's their ultimate calculation. That's Netanyahu's. Okay, the whole world is turned against us. We're, as a fairly recent poll showed it, we are the most hated nation in the world. That's just a fact. That's what the polls show. But who cares? We have the U.S., at our back, and we have this unconditional support. But then what happens if that's the big question? He's just banking on that. He and the other, members of his coalition and of the entire across the spectrum in the Israeli political class, they are all banking on U.S. support, unconditional U.S. support. But what if that really begins to waver? Now we just have, we have a few outliers, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a few others in Congress. But that pressure is building, and that gap between, what the political class advocates and what people, what the average person think, that gap grows greater and greater, every day. And there's a chance that that gap just may become a yawning abyss and it'll become unsustainable at some point. Yeah, I don't know. Again, it's just like, we can see this happen. It's actually happening with great speed, on the ground, but you just don't see it reflected in the power structures, in the establishment, right? That takes longer. I mean, those powers are well entrenched. I think, as I said earlier, this is something that, like the Zionist power, is something that was built up over the course of decades. It's something like you could call it a 75-year project, and it's not going to die overnight. But it can't last. It can't last very long, in a vacuum, without some kind of popular support. They still have, like the Christian Zionists on the right. They still have.
I wonder how strong that
support,
is.
The more important thing is the support of the megadonors. I think the megadonors are safe. We'll see. Like with the Christian Zionists, that's the big question.
Right. That's what I was going to say. I wonder if that.
I think it's quite strong. I mean, these people they're essentially they're Netanyahu supporters. They think like he does.
That's so crazy because it's just so unchristian. I just feel, this is something that I really appreciate Tucker doing, because I think he is sort of working at the Christian Zionist side a bit. That's part of his audience. I think we're probably Christian Zionists maybe 5 years ago, and he's probably have shown the light on, lifted the veil from a lot of their eyes, because he's always talking about, as a fellow Christian, what we should be doing. And it's just hard for me to believe that anybody can call themselves a Christian and support starvation and genocide. And if it becomes so apparent, that I feel like there would be a backlash. Like if I was somebody that believed in Israel because I was raised that way and that's how I went to church, and then I found this, I would have a huge amount of resentment. There's got to be a crisis happening, identity crisis. Like what is going on? Either I have to harden myself and accept that, like, yes, the right path, what God wants is just to kill all these women and children, which is just horrible. Or you have to say that, I've been fed a lie. My whole faith has been a lie. But I think, and this is also something that worries me as well, is this, I worry about how corrupted our society has become thanks to Israel and its actions. I mean, I understand how corrupted our government is, but I'm just talking about our society as a whole. If there are people that, look at what Israel's doing and they try to make excuses for it, is that poisoning our society as a whole? And even after Israel falls, will we be forever poisoned by this, by Zionism?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, that's a good question. It's a very hard question to answer. But again, we pointed out how there has been just a general lowering of standards, that the things that were unthinkable, even in some cases 18 months ago, happen now, and they don't garner any kind of criticism. And that's a disturbing trend. There's been sort of a growing callousness and an acceptance of brutality, and an embrace of even genocide. Because I think on a certain levels, a certain portion of the population here understands what's going on, and they have come to terms with it. It's just like they say, well, okay, yeah, maybe we really just need to kill them off. But it's hard to explain some of the, because you do get comments like that. Of course, you get them directly from Israeli leaders, but we have heard comments from American opinion leaders, at least. A certain congressman, and like I guess Randy Fine is one example. We do get what you could term a pro-genocide comment, it's the sort of thing. So, that's the frightening thing, is that, like, are we really coming to terms with genocide? I think some some of our people are, within this country. That's a frightening turn of events. But, you just hope that there's enough humanity in the rest of us that we wake up, from this nightmare and turn away from it. I don't have the answer. I guess we're going to find out, and we're maybe finding out right now. And we do see some encouraging signs. Again, there's a big question is somebody like, again, Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who is an ardent Christian Zionist. And he's supported all kinds. He's basically supports and I think still, supported and probably still supports the settler movement in the West Bank, for example. And they have been on a rampage. Of course, when he took notice when they started like desecrating the church in Taipei, the Christian village there, and burning cars and, doing, wreaking all kinds of devastation there. Now, is it in his mind, it's just, it's unacceptable when this violence is directed against Christians, but it's acceptable when, Muslim children are killed? You kind of wonder, or maybe it's just like he wasn't willing to look, but this may be the opening where he begins to see the bigger picture. At this point, it's too early to say. You always have to begin somewhere. It's just, and maybe this is the beginning. We'll see what happens to Mike Huckabee. Does he actually really wake up? I mean, he did direct some pretty stern criticisms against the Israeli government, which I think took a lot of people by surprise. But is he going to just kind of, is there a firm wall between Christian victims and Muslim victims, and it's okay? Again, is he going to accept the starvation of Muslim children? Maybe not. Well, let's hope so. Let's hope
he
not.
will.
Is what I mean to say. You might be right.
Yeah,
you might be right, and there may be a lot of people like him. I mean, that he represents a strain of, the Christian Zionists who really, there's something in that attracted to them. It's not just they got the wool pulled over their eyes, but there is something about this raw exercise of power that actually attracts them, and even the violence. That's a scary thought. But I have to say that it's got to be true, at least in some cases. And maybe, we'll find out how extensive it is. Things like these crises they're moments of truth. They help to expose who we are. All along, maybe in the past you could pretend I'm a Christian Zionist and I'm, full of love for all of humanity. Now you can't really say you're a Christian Zionist and you love all of humanity. You're actually fine with killing a large portion of humanity, if they're on. That's what this war has done. I think it's forced people to really, in some cases, just reveal who they are and make a choice about who they are and what they really stand for. It's happening before our eyes, and we'll just see. Let's just hope that there are more people that what I would say, return to a true Christianity and reject this, Christian Zionism.
Yeah. I think part of a strategy that the Zionists have is to just, completely other Muslims, and that we should look at this almost as a holy war, and that these are, evil hordes, and we are the, holy crusaders fighting. And I think some people that just don't think deeply just kind of like that idea, and then they can grasp on it. And so they're really playing on this, this racism, that, I didn't really feel like the U.S. had, we always like to say there's a lot of racism. I'm sure there's differences, but I feel like here is kind of just a real concerted effort to create this racism, to really create it, which is just so ironic. We spent so much time to just say how we need to combat racism and we're all equal and all this stuff. That's what we're always talking about. And then you just have this very open effort to say, except for the Muslims and the Palestinians, the Arabs in general, just Muslims. Yeah, they're bad. We can all agree with that. And they're a threat to our Western civilization. So, it's okay to go scorched earth. You have to go scorched earth. And I think, it's a sick part that's of our society that, I think it's a minority, but I'm just worried about that little poison that's in here, because ideologies are so hard to combat. The Zionism, we have the same thing in Ukraine with banderism. Right. Like, how do you you can't get rid of it. So, and people like Randy Fine, like after this is all over and he's out of office, does he just get to have a normal life and just kind of sink it back in the shadow where he's openly tweeting like, starve away as a congressman, as a representative, somebody that should have accountability, or is there going to be some type of trial for him? I think that's almost what people are looking for at this point. It's like, are we going to have Nuremberg after this? And are these people that pushed this lie, allowed this to happen, made it possible, and spent so much time on trying to distill hate against these people that did nothing to us?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think the comparison to Ukraine is good. Think about it at the start. If you go back, especially like a couple of decades, the true believing Banderites were just a very tiny percentage of the population. It was pointed out that in elections, they rarely ever won seats. They only represented like 2% of the legislatures and that kind of thing. But that 2% was very, very zealous. They were passionate, and the 98%, unfortunately, the vast majority of them didn't really have very strong principles. And so, when push came to shove and, as conflict broke out and the government needed people who would really fight, they turned to the Banderites. They empowered them, and the Banderites have, they made this pact with the devil, and now the Banderites rule the roost in so many ways in Ukraine and have really transformed Ukraine. I'd like to think that the majority of people there are not Banderites. I think it's fair to say, but they have been affected by it. And very much so that the country has been poisoned by it. And the same thing you can say about Christian Zionism, maybe the people that really, really believe in it, are a small minority, but a passionate small minority. And in the case of the Christian Zionists, okay, well, a lot of these people are sort of outside of the centers of power. We're talking about the hinterland, we're talking about the Bible Belt in the U.S., but they are allied with secular and Jewish Zionists that have a lot of power. And so, this is going to be, looking at the numbers, it's good. It's shifting in the right direction, but there's still powerful forces arrayed on the other side. And then, what we'll see is it'll be interesting. I mean, I guess more than interesting, that's really not an adequate word to describe it. But we're going to, these are people that are not going to go down without a fight. I don't know. These are people passionately attached to, this idea of a greater Israel. And will they simply, lose an election at some point and say, okay, we lost and walk away? I'm not sure that that's what's going to happen. And if there's this growing, this, like I was saying at the beginning, this growing abyss between the power elites and the common people, well, these power elites, these are people that are passionately attached to their own power and their visions of how to use that power. If they're really threatened, by a popular revolution, it looks like they're going to lose an election. I think they've already shown, that they have ways of hanging on to power, and it just may become more and more blatant over time. And I think we're seeing that both in Europe and in this country.
I heard Mearsheimer say something that possibly Trump, is just a theory, is being threatened behind closed doors, because Trump, openly said, there's starvation in Gaza. He says it, right. And this is something that we are 100% complicit in. We are funding it. We are making it possible for all this to happen in Gaza. And so if you're even have this open admission of starvation, but at the same time, Trump does nothing. Not even just a token, movement. Like, instead, he threatens all of our allies, Portugal, Canada, Palestine, whatever. Oh, you dare recognize Palestine, that you're going to feel it from the United States. So why, it just seems like even for the best interest of Israel, you should be offering some like advice and criticism, like, hey, this is not the way to go about things. We can, let's talk, we can work it out. Instead, it's just no criticism whatsoever. Just don't talk about it. Even though we acknowledge that there's starvation, it's like, why would he do that? Shouldn't it be politically savvy to, throw a few breadcrumbs? But we're not seeing it. So Do you think that's possible? He's being threatened, and if so, who? Who is it? I mean, is he in danger of being assassinated if he goes too far against the? I mean, he's not going against it at all. So, I mean, I don't think he's in any danger of it. But I mean,
right. Well, it's certainly possible, but I don't think you need to look for that explanation in his case, because he has always been, an ardent Zionist. You see what he did in his first term, the recognition of the Golan Heights, the relocation of the embassy to Jerusalem. That he's always been an ardent Zionist. He's always, had the support again of the Zionist megadonors. And he's been surrounded by these kind of people, his closest associates, like Witkoff. Witkoff himself is an ardent Zionist. So I don't know that we really need to go there. I'll admit it's possible. It's just that, okay, well, I think in the case of Trump, what makes him different and makes people wonder what's going on is that he's not a very disciplined person. He especially doesn't watch his mouth, all kinds of things. It's just like a thought crosses his head and then his big mouth opens and he says something. Now somebody else, who's firmly on the Zionist team might, see some of these images of starving kids, but he knows, okay, yeah, I better not talk about that. Maybe I'll talk to somebody about that behind closed doors, but he just said it out loud, because I think it actually appeared on Fox News. That's an example, again, of a little bit of the horror is leaking into these places that have worked so hard to keep us from seeing it. So, yeah, I don't discount that. I don't say that's an impossibility. It's certainly, again, President Johnson, we learned later, was threatened by powerful Zionists, and it was one reason, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons that he called off the investigation into the USS Liberty incident. So there certainly could be, these people will apply pressure wherever they can, use whatever means, but I think in the case they don't. Trump, I don't think they need to apply a whole lot of pressure. Maybe.
I don't know. Just our politicians, when I hear any politician say, I stand with Israel, in my mind, I'm thinking they're saying, I raped kids on Epstein's Island, and yeah. I know, okay, all right, maybe I know not everybody is, but I know I'm not the only one thinking that. And that is going to be a big problem for all these politicians, is that when you say, I stand with Israel, when it's so contrary to America's interest and your own political interest, that's what I'm going to be registering, that like, big possibility that this man might be a pedophile, I know who maybe not, or they're just completely compromised. But the fact that people are making that association, and I know I'm not the only one saying it, thinking that, that's a problem. I just don't understand how we can continue forward as a society when we have this situation. It's just mind blowing to me. It's such a weird situation that we're in. It's just unprecedented. It's just so odd, and I just don't know how it's going to. It's changing now. Everybody's aware of it, and everybody's just horrified. Like, oh my God, this is true that this tiny country that's engaged in a genocide controls our government, and we are, and has poisoned our country. Like, just the moral, fall for the United States, just in our support of this, the complicity of this, is just it's ruined the United States. And I think that was one good thing that the interview that Tucker had with Tony Aguilar, which I think everybody should watch. I mean, this guy is 25 years in the service, Green Beret, Special Forces, Purple Heart, Awards for Valor in combat zones all over the Middle East and in Asia. And so he's coming at it from a person that is an American, soldier, decorated. And he talks about, like, he joined to, protect the oppressed and defend the defenseless. That's what we were supposed to be. And I think a lot of people that may have joined the army initially have that idea. You don't want to join the army to be like, oh boy, I'm going to be a bad guy and kill people. Or maybe there are some psychos and we need to weed those people out. But for the most part, you want to have the army people you want to get people that join. And I think a lot of people do join because they want to do good. They want to be a force for good. But when it becomes so clear that we are part of a force for evil and a complicity, it's just like, it destroys everything. It destroys everything. Like, what are we fighting for? Why are we here? Like, if there is a war, why you just come to this realization that we're the bad guys. And I think that's happening through every level of society, including the armed forces. And it's just, I just don't know how it's going to tear everything apart. It is tearing things apart, though.
Right. Well, it is. It's it's going to be interesting. We are, I think it's fair to say that we're in uncharted waters. And it's true in the U.S., as everything, every country has its unique situation. Every region is unique, but there are, the conditions are broadly similar, throughout the Western world. And again, you just have this elite that is wedded to a certain vision. It's globalist and it's also Zionist. I think those are two different things, but it is both those things. And these people that have been brought up and now, rule these countries, they have imbibed, they have become true believers in the process. It was a long process of education and promotion. You learn, this is to be part of the ruling elite. You adopt certain ideas. And over time, these are the people that rose to the top. These are the people that, that rule our countries. The Macrons, the Starmers, the Mertzes, and Donald Trump's kind of different, but Donald Trump too. And yet, they're a product of a time, of a set of circumstances that doesn't exist now. I think like the people that are rising up now, people that are students at Ivy League schools, probably look at the world very differently than those people did. And they don't have, at least when it comes to Israel and Zionism, I'm not quite sure about the globalism, but I think it's got to have an impact on that too. Yeah, there has been a real shift. Now, how is this all going to play out? I really don't know. I mean, this is, you have you can think a lot of, how empires fall and regimes, dynasties fall. You just have there is this ruling caste that loses contact with reality. I'm thinking again, like at the end of the Qing dynasty in China, there's people they ruled so long that they had the sense that, that China belonged to them and that, and they had a formula for ruling. And it had worked for hundreds of years. You can even see a millennia, if you go to previous dynasties. But the ground had shifted under their feet. And in the end, there was just a total collapse. That's maybe somewhat of a far-fetched analogy, but I think there is something there. That's what we're looking at. Now, how it's all going to play out. At the end, it's like for a real revolution to occur, you have to have some organized revolutionary force. And we don't have that at this point. We have a lot of anger. We have a lot of bitterness. We have a lot of disbelief, on the side of the populations, again, throughout the Western world. The approval ratings for all these leaders are just way, are way down, often even in single digits in some cases, but quite often below 20%. I think it's 19% for Macron, for example, and I think it's very similar for Starmer. Well, anyway, you can see this is, and then you look at the broader situation. It's not just that these leaders are popular, but in general, institutions have lost their legitimacy over time. This is something that didn't happen just overnight, but we see it accelerating. So there is this vacuum, and so the question arises: what's going to fill the vacuum? Because you can have a majority of people easily, that strongly disapprove of the present situation, but if they're not organized, you have to. if they're not actually organized and they haven't, um, into a party or into what, a militia or whatever, you have to have something, some organized force to actually affect a revolutionary change, and that's not here yet. So again, I think back to the end of the Qing dynasty, there was this collapse. I mean, this establishment just collapsed because it become so it divorced from reality, that at some point it became incapable of ruling. But there wasn't really an adequate replacement, so you had this period of chaos. Um, Maybe we'll see something similar here. I don't know.
Did the Qing dynasty go to war before it collapsed?
Well, there were wars, the humiliations, that it was the Japanese, yeah, in 1895. And of course, the European powers just came in and carved up. There was the Opium Wars, in the earlier part of the 19th century.
Okay.
But yeah, these were all humiliations that demonstrated the weakness of the Qing dynasty.
Yeah, well, what I'm worried about right now is that as the pressure turns up on Israel, as this wave, I feel like every couple months, I mean, it's steady that the support for Israel goes down, but then we're having this increased acceleration because of the starvation, and more people are jumping on. And once you break through that veil, I think it's got to be such a relief for that person that has gone over on the side. It's like, because you're in the moral position now, and it just got to feel better. It can't feel good when you're defending this constantly, and then more and more people are out trying to say, like, what are you doing? Look at these pictures, look at this video. And eventually it's like, I feel like if you break through the other side, it's got to be such a relief, like, oh my God, I'm not defending evil anymore. So as this pressure begins to mount up, I think that Israel, the way what they do is, if everybody's yelling at them about Gaza and they're starting to see some real repercussions or potential threats to their aid, that they'll start a war with Iran, that they'll start it back up, that they're going to do whatever they can to get it going again, because we saw that happen when that 12-day war, is that they kind of upped things up in the West Bank and in Palestine, because all eyes were just watching everything between Iran and Israel. And so I think that's what, that's still the end goal. I mean, so do you think that the likelihood of the war striking up between Iran and Israel will increase as the pressure and the eyes on Gaza are becoming more and more focused?
Yeah, I think there's a real chance. It goes down to Netanyahu and his coalition, and the coalition is holding together for the time being, but it's constantly. I think there's, I believe the Knesset's in recess, and so there's a few weeks there that Netanyahu has, before he's going to be presented with these challenges, challenges from the ultra-Orthodox who want to have an exemption, a military, service exemption, which is very, very unpopular for obvious reasons with the general population. And then there, in general, there is dissatisfaction with the war in Gaza, not unfortunately because of the suffering of the Palestinians there, but because of the hostages. We're talking about 50 hostages dead and alive that a majority of Jewish Israelis just want to bring home, and they want actually Netanyahu to stop the war so they can be brought home. We're talking about 3/4 of the population is in favor of actually stopping the war. Temporarily, at least, get them home, and then you can start it again, and they don't, care. The problem is he's got 3/4 of the population who want that. You want a ceasefire so that the hostages can be brought home. But then you have the extremists within his coalition that are saying, if you do if a ceasefire, if you agree to a ceasefire, we're out of here. And if they leave his coalition, then he won't be able to rule. There have to be elections, and there's a chance that he could lose power. So he's in a very, very, very precarious situation. So the incentives, as we talked about before, are always there, to launch a war. Now, I'm not saying that that's what caused him to launch that 12-day war against Iran, but it may, I certainly factored into it, or I strongly suspect that it factored into it. And in fact, again, it's not just the question of his coalition, but of his own freedom, because there are these corruption charges that have been brought against him. And I believe actually he was supposed to be in court on the day that the war against Iran began. But because of that, he was able to cancel this appearance. So, you're just looking at this again, just the incentives of this one man and this coalition. It's the same dangerous mix that we talked about before, and it's already, I think it's fair to say, resulted in this 12-day war. And I'm sure he's looking for a way to do it again. I don't hear the steady drumbeat. Before it was always war against the Iran war, and I'm not hearing it now. But if we may start hearing it again soon. That there was this obvious pressure to push for war leading up to the war. We had seen it before; it had failed, under past administrations. This time it succeeded. I haven't heard reports that he's doing that yet, but it may be that he just feels safe, while the Knesset is in recess. And then he may, also, he understands that they have to get, plug some of the holes in their defense, get more interceptors for air defense interceptors, for example. All these things are, I'm sure we're looking at. So we'll see, if we start hearing that drumbeat for war, then I think, I think we may see another one, and it may be driven by the personal considerations of Netanyahu again.
Oh, Netanyahu, Trump, and Zelensky. These are great champions of the Western world. As I think people try to paint it as. It's crazy. These guys are nuts.
Yeah.
Do we? Yeah. Do you want to go over to another section of the world?
Sure. Yeah, I thought maybe we could talk briefly about Ukraine. You mentioned Zelensky. I was thinking, of course, we've had these protests, right, in Kiev, and this was following the decision to put those anti-corruption agencies, under the direct control of the Kiev regime. Whereas before they were really pretty much under the control of the West. That's what. Now this is, it strikes me that over the course of actually since the launch of the SMO and before, there has been, one after another erosion of democracy. Obvious erosion of democracy within Ukraine. There's one after another opposition political party has been suppressed. Opposition media outlets, TV stations have been shut down. People have been arrested. The Russian language has been suppressed. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church is being suppressed, and churches shut down, and priests in some case, arrested, or even, I don't know if any have been sent to the front lines, but threatened with conscription. So, this is one after another really outrage against anything that I think when any normal understanding of what democracy is, but you never heard a peep out of the West.
It's also the suspension of elections.
Right. Okay, yeah, good. That's actually right. Right.
It's a big
I
one.
mentioned that it's a long
No
list,
elections.
but I didn't even mention that one. Right. No elections. Right. A very good point. But just everybody's fine with that. There's just no criticism. And instead, we're always hearing about how Zelensky and his government is somehow they're champions of democracy against, the evil hordes from the East. And yet now all of a sudden there was a reaction, when Zelensky made the effort, to actually wrest control of these anti-corruption agencies from the West. Then you heard about, oh no, Ukraine is sliding into authoritarianism. And you had a lot of very direct criticisms, both from mainstream media outlets and from and from Western politicians. And then the EU even went so far as to suspend aid. So what does this tell you? It's just like, okay, all these other things we mentioned, this long list of, outrages against very obviously anti-democratic measures. No response. The aid continues to flow. But what was the one move that caused the aid to stop? And that was trying to wrest control from the West. So, you can just see it. It's very revealing that this is what, this is the concern. It's not actually, even though it's dressed up as a concern for democracy, there clearly is no concern for democracy. But it's like if you try to become independent, pull yourself away from our Western control, that's when the alarm bells go off. And then, you're going to suffer the consequences. So Zelensky was forced to actually retract, present a new bill. And then, his party very obediently has now voted to approve it. That these agencies are now back under the control of the West. They're not under the control of the Kiev regime. Now it's interesting. There is, what's her name? Mariana Bezukaya is a kind of a well-known dissident, a very outspoken individual within the Rada who is often criticizes the government. She's a Ukrainian nationalist. But she's one who's been very honest and, has been kind of a gadfly there. She actually very strongly opposed returning these anti-corruption agencies, to their original so-called independent status. And why is that? It's because just this, she said, we're no longer going to be a sovereign nation. This is actually bowing to the West. So anyway, I found this whole episode just very, very revealing. It's something that we've seen in other places, but I found it particularly striking. It's a new understanding what democracy is. You're democratic if, you submit to the West. You can do anything, again, shut down opposition parties, no more elections, whatever. You're still democratic as long as you obey us. But once you try to be independent, like we've seen in Georgia and other places, that's when the wrath of the West comes down upon you.
Right. For Ukraine to be sovereign, really, it has to have a neutral status. Like that's what really Russia has been pushing for. Have neutrality. That gives you sovereignty. Really, what we've seen is the countries that join NATO, you give up your sovereignty by doing that. In NATO and the EU, we're seeing it. We just see the European Union, the European countries have essentially no sovereignty. It's really sad, actually, just looking at these European countries. They just can't do anything. It's just like, man, you guys have really been neutered, and they're latched to this crazy beast that's the United States, which is latched to a genocidal state that is Israel, that is controlling everything. It's just taking us all down. We're all going down with it. It's crazy.
Yeah, not controlling everything, but certainly foreign policy in the Middle East. I'll say that.
Okay, sure, but it's just I keep on going back towards Israel just because it's been on my mind so much. It's just like, oh man, this is just out of control. It is a
huge problem. I agree with you. Yeah, no question about it.
Do you think that Zelensky, though, he's now that he's made this move to introduce the new bill and sort of submit himself back to the Western control, that he's relatively safe, that, there was talk about potentially ousting him, or is he in the clear now?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. The thing is, like, one thing is, like, if these agencies are... I guess these agencies were beginning to investigate people around him, not him personally, but some of his close associates, including Yermak, I believe. And that was a sign that maybe the West was beginning to lose patience with him, and that, he did this. This was kind of a preemptive attack, and it failed. They didn't allow him to do it. So it'll be interesting. His position, it doesn't seem very secure, as president, but let's say it is threatened. It seems like again, we've had these stories, this increasing criticism from the West. We have this whole episode of the anti-corruption agencies. It suggests that something is afoot here. But he still does have a very tight control of the government, and that's something he's been working on for these last few years. So even with these pressures, it's not going to be easy to dislodge him. And then the question is, if you dislodge him, why exactly? Who's going to do anything different? I don't really even understand. I think there probably are some people, or some factions, again, within, Western governments that do want to see him go, who favor Zelensky, for example. But is Zelensky really going to be that different? Maybe on the battlefield he will be. Maybe that's what it's all about. That's the only thing I can think of, is that Zelensky he's not a brilliant commander, but he does have, an understanding of what's happening on the battlefronts. He does understand war better than Zelensky does, who doesn't seem to understand it at all. All he understands is PR. And, that's led to a lot of disasters, like the Kursk incursion. That's one of the best examples, but it's not the only one. And this general policy of just hanging on to every place until it's really too late, like Avdiivka, or, now Pokrovsk. It looks like they're going to stay there until it's too late and lose a lot of men in the process. But that's been always his policy. Somebody like Zelensky understands that it makes sense in military terms sometimes to retreat, to consolidate, to build up fortifications, in the rear, and not wait until it's too late. So, it means that maybe under Zelensky, you could wage this war you're still going to lose it, but you can put off the collapse anyway, maybe by another year or something, if pursue a more sensible strategy. So maybe that's what's behind it, but it's not clear to me. It's not clear that they'll even succeed. I mean, Zelensky's out there in London, but maybe they'll just fly him in, and who knows? We'll see.
Isn't it a problem though that Zelensky is a pretty open neo-Nazi? I mean, this guy has two
busts of
problem,
Stefan.
No. But I mean, like, it's
right.
so obvious, though. Like, if you just Google this guy's name and Nazi, you can, it's all there. You can just see pictures of him.
Well, you can see, or you see the two busts of Bandera, in the background in his office in the previous interviews. Like, one bust was not enough. Two busts of Bandera. He's a true believer, more so than Zelensky or anything. Like, he's always been a Banderite. But it doesn't seem to matter. No, he's championed by a lot of people in the West. That's the thing, we're talking about all these things. It's not, it's talking about all these obviously anti-democratic measures that were employed, the crackdowns, and it doesn't bother anybody. I mean, it just doesn't. And now, again, look at Syria. Who do we have in charge? I thought we were supposed to be fighting Al-Qaeda, and we put Al-Qaeda's guy there. I mean, as long as you're opposed to the Russians, you're opposed to the emerging, if they can use you as a tool against, a geopolitical enemy, they'll use you. And so they don't care. He's a Banderite, but he's fighting the Russians, and they think he might do a better job of fighting the Russians than the other guy.
The United States we've gone so off the deep end. If you just think about, how we're openly supporting Israel, that's engaged in a genocide, that's very open, and we can all see it. And then at the same time in Syria, Al-Qaeda, they're supposed to, took down the towers, attacked America. They're our enemy. Now we put them in charge. Al-Qaeda now has a whole country, Al-Qaeda / ISIS. And then, the greatest villain of the 20th century, Hitler, we're all about, the Nazis were the most evil thing in the world. That's what we're all told. And we're just openly supporting Nazis in Ukraine. It's just like the whole thing is just so crazy. It's like, okay, our allies, ethno-supremacist, genocidal Jewish state Israel, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Jalani in Syria, neo-Nazi, Banderites in Ukraine. Right. It's like, can we find any more bad guys? Any more? Right. Those are like any more evil that we can support? Like it's crazy. It's so crazy. Everything
Right.
that we're supposed to be
Right. Well,
fighting against, and
yeah.
it's just been turned upside down. Just
Right.
we are the bad
Right. Well,
guys.
again, in both these cases, like when you look at the Banderites, I mean, going way, way back to the late 40s, early 50s, the U.S. government has been supporting them because they saw that was the one, again, the one force, the one group of people that was willing to actually take up arms against the Soviet Union. So they did provide support through them, through the 50s until they were eventually just wiped out by the Soviets or totally suppressed. And then, of course, in the case of Al Qaeda, we've had this on again, off again relationship with them, going all the way back to Bin Laden, and then during the Yemen war, for example, Al Qaeda was on the ground fighting the Houthis, and we didn't fly the planes to Directory, but it's our planes serviced by our people, and was essentially Al Qaeda's air force in Yemen. So, this is something, and these are just a couple of examples, so this is something, we have a history of using these people, for geopolitical objectives. And then I guess the thing that I wonder is, like, you go so far with it, like, again, you make this bargain with the devil. You tell yourself, these people are crazy, they're evil, but we can use them, because there's a greater good. But at some place, you work closely with these people for such a long time. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I start to wonder whether or not there becomes some sort of, you start to go beyond that. You're not just using them. You're starting to be kind of come them. That's what we've
You
seen
fuse with
happen.
them,
For
right?
example, in Ukraine, again, like when 2014, the fighting broke out in the East. Well, this new Ukrainian government that, was installed as a result of the coup, they realized that actually, a lot of those people out in the East, their soldiers didn't want to fight because they saw they were fighting their own countrymen. They didn't want to do it. But these crazy Banderites, they wanted to go out and kill them. And so they made this bargain with the devil, and now you have a Banderite country. Now we've worked closely with these people. We're championing Zaluzhny. It's, maybe we can kind of maintain this distance, but you sort of wonder because, like, one thing that's happening in Europe, you start to see this rewriting of history because the Russians are evil. Now we start to kind of play down the Soviet role, which of course was enormous in World War II. They contributed, really much the greater part towards the victory over the Germans. But it's played down. They're not invited to memorial or commemorative ceremonies, and then you get a real reworking of history, and then toppling of Soviet statues, and then within Ukraine at least, and I think to some extent within the Baltic states, championing of the local opponents of the Soviet Union. And in World War II, those local opponents of the Soviet Union were, undeniably very closely associated with the Nazis, if they were not outright Nazis themselves. And so you say, well, right now it's just sort of beginning, but you can see this process of just actually of revising the entire history and our stance with, regard to World War II. And I don't know how far it's going to go, but you wonder.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine there will be another massive rewrite once the Western U.S.-led, empire falls. That's going to be an interesting reckoning. I mean, it's happening right now. Are you worried about Trump when he hits his 10-day? Well, we got 7 days left, I think. Maybe next Saturday, I guess, will be.
Yeah.
Do you think something is going to?
Right. I don't know what he can do. I mean, the thing is, like, they're in the middle of negotiations with China. Earlier, he said this 100%, right? But now I think in the case of India, I said, well, because it's not clear exactly what he's trying to impose on India, but it was said because you're buying Russian oil and Russian arms, and you supposedly have a trade surplus with us, and there was something else, I'm punishing you. It's going to be 25% tariffs. Well, according to his original threat, it was going to be 100%, right? And So I don't know, now there's China. He's not talking about China, which is interesting. And because we're in the middle of these trade negotiations with China, and it's really, we're the weaker party. And I'm sure that like he's getting that information. It's like, we can't do this, Trump. I don't know how he's going to wiggle out of this. He promised 100%. We used to hear them referred to as crushing sanctions, right? Um, and yeah, it seems like he's trying to play the tough guy, but what's he going to actually do when the time comes? Is he going to perform some kind of Houdini act? He's going to do something symbolic, declare a great victory. A lot of these trade deals, when you look at them, they're really, it's not clear if anything was done other than, okay, the 15% tariff. I think that's something that he can impose and, it is imposed through an executive order. So we have a 15% tariff on Japan, on Europe, and so forth. But then all this other stuff about hundreds of billions of dollars investment and hundreds of billions of dollars committed to the purchase of American LNG. None of that is actually, that's just verbiage. Nobody's actually signed on any dotted line. And the people that he's negotiating with can't even really make good on those promises because those are decisions made by private companies. What I've heard is that like in real trade treaties take months, if not years, to work out, and they're long. There's lots of fine print, whatever. These are just at most like kind of frameworks, and they're not enforceable. So there's a bit that's real. I think the 15%'s like real, and that is significant. But the rest of it is just a lot of smoke and mirrors. So I don't know. Is it going to just be a lot of smoke and mirrors a few days from now? That's probably that would be my guess.
I feel like he has to do something, and something that I'm maybe a little bit worried about is that maybe the tariffs and all this stuff is kind of a misdirection, and he might escalate militarily. I mean, like we saw what happened with Iran while we're in the middle of negotiations with them. And it's just, I just don't know with Trump now. He seems to really live in his own world. I think he really does have a God complex. I think he is being blackmailed and that he's in a desperate position. He is, Trump as a pedo is still trending. People still think that the Epstein stuff's not going away. I'm just think anything's on the table now, including military escalation with Russia. We have talk of, General Donahue talking about how we can take Kaliningrad, like this crazy talk. And right. So I don't know. I'm expecting something. I think he has to do something, and maybe it won't be the tariffs, but it's going to be something. Thing is,
right. Yeah. Oh, you may be right. Again, it's just like, okay, these people can be, we're thinking through, trying to logically, but and looking at what's been done in the past, but who knows what kind of crazy schemes are being cooked up, in those back rooms right now. Again, like none of us foresaw how the attack on Iran, would begin. So is there something similar, some kind of, something similar to Operation Spiderweb? Who knows? You're right. There's all kinds of things that could happen. And it may prove to be a misdirection because you look at the trade thing, it just doesn't add up. And nobody believes it. Like I pointed out, the markets just don't believe it. It just doesn't make any sense. So maybe there's something else going on. That's a good point. It could be. And who knows what it is.
Yeah, since we've had these conversations, I've been feeling like we're at the most dangerous point ever. And, since these wars broke out, since these conflicts started, do you feel that way? That we are really, now it's just getting more and more dangerous by the day?
Yeah, we're at a very dangerous point. First of all, with regard to Iran, before there were negotiations, and those were negotiations that could have been successfully concluded. There was really nothing to prevent it from happening. Again, we did it before. We could have done it again. Iran was willing, they were willing to bargain away their 60% enriched uranium and have a second version of the JCPOA, even something more stringent. I think under Pezeshkian it could have happened, but we blew it. As this attack in Iran, and it seems to me very unlikely that they're going to ever go back to the negotiating table, not for a long, long time. And they have every incentive to race towards a nuclear weapon. So the situation there is actually much scarier, and the possibility of some sort of peaceful solution is just much more distant than it ever was. And then in the case of, you know, of Ukraine, yeah, there were some reasons to be hopeful. There seemed to be a breath of fresh air and a new approach when Trump took office, and we heard some very exciting statements from him and some of the people around him. But yeah, now we're getting this threats, and that seems to be what the negotiations seem to have ended, and we're now. Trump is just, wielding a big stick and trying to threaten Russia, which is kind of where we were before. And there's, talk of lifting the restrictions on the long range missiles. Yeah, it is scary. And then it looks like we're back on the escalation ladder there. And we know what's at the very top of that escalation ladder. If we keep on going up, the very last rung is nuclear. So, every rung you go up is just another rung closer to it. It is a very frightening situation.
Right. When we talk about these rungs, I feel like there's not that many left before we get to the nuclear, because I think we'll just skip the conventional ground troop type of war, because it just won't happen. You can't get the support for it. The people aren't going to sign up for it. I think you will have a revolt at that stage, when it gets to that point, especially if it's doing it on behalf of Israel. I think it's at that point now where no way, it's not going to happen. So I feel like then you just jump straight to nuclear, right? And that's what's scary, because there's just a few people that are in control, and the people that are in control are compromised individuals that are scared for their life and their career and everything else, and they'll do whatever they can to maintain on the power, and they have the ability to end the world, unfortunately.
Yeah. And they believe very strongly in this project. I mean, this is what they've devoted their lives to. And, so,
I feel like, I feel like a deer in the headlights. I'm fascinated. I'm just watching this play out and happen.
Right.
But I just feel like we always talk about this in this conclusion, and it just feels like that's where we're headed. And then probably, I still think that the good chance not. There's off ramps that will present itself maybe at the darkest hour, but maybe there won't.
Right.
That's so crazy.
Yeah. No, you're right. I don't disagree with you. I mean, it is a very scary situation. I'm not going to, maybe it's just that I just hope for the best. Maybe I'm being a fool, but I kind of assume, maybe just because it's easier to assume this than to look at the alternative. I assume that at the very end, when we get up to the edge of the abyss, we're going to say, oh no, we're not going to take the plunge, and we'll avoid nuclear war. That's my guess. But I think I've said this before, but it's not really, it's not a very firm conviction. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we can end it there, Dad. Unless you have one more, a little bit left in you.
No, I don't have anything to add. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me just ask you one other thing, because there's something I wanted to bring up. Just we don't have to go too deep into it. It's just Trump's stance now with India. From my understanding, it seems like he's going after India pretty hard, which is a bit odd for me, because I felt like within the BRICS country, India was always kind of the weaker link, because it always wanted to have good relationships with the United States. But with this move that Trump is making, it's just like, okay, if Modi was on the fence on anything, he's fully going to be in BRICS now, right? I mean, what was the reasoning behind this attack on India?
Well, I think it's as you pointed out, that they were seen as a weak link, and the way Trump looks at it, maybe we can bully them into being on our side. But so far, anyway, it may be that India will cave in. It's not impossible. They're not as powerful as China is, and they're not as firmly committed, I think, to resisting American hegemony. There is a chance that they'll cave in, but so far it looks like they're, the U.S. approach is, trying to force India to capitulate is having the opposite effect. It's induced a very strong reaction again against this bullying, and I think we've seen something similar in Brazil too. Lula is furious about these attempts to bully him and his government. In general, I think that's what we've seen is actually with the larger, more powerful countries in the world, the Trump approach is not bearing dividends, but quite the opposite. With some of the smaller countries, the weaker countries, the ones that are truly dependent on the U.S., at least in the short run, okay, his approach does seem to produce some dividends. Like Panama, for example, agreed to kick out some of the Chinese companies from the canal zone, right? And then the Europeans, capitulated, gave them the 15%. I think the rest of that is the talk about the hundreds of billions in investment and LNG purchases is probably not real, but 15% is something considerable, when there's no reciprocal tariffs on American goods. But though Europe you think would be powerful, they're weak. They've made themselves subservient to the U.S. over the years. They haven't taken advantage of this, emerging multipolar order to actually increase their sovereignty, by building ties with other major powers like China, for example. Because they have stood so solidly within the U.S. camp, they've made themselves hostile to much of the rest of the world and have made themselves completely subservient. So you have subservient Europeans and all these smaller countries, capitulating to Trump. Again, and maybe to some extent, South Korea and Japan. Though I think there's a real danger. It's like in the short run, they say, okay, we just got to give in, but this is crazy. We've got to look at our options. Maybe it's time to actually fundamentally reorient our foreign policy and try to build up relationships, with other great powers like China. I think in the long run, it won't be beneficial to the U.S. Now, and then it's immediately, you're seeing an immediate rejection from the greater powers, the larger, the BRICS countries like Brazil and India. They may cave in to some extent, but so far, it's made them realize their need for the BRICS, I think, more than ever.
Right. It just seems like a very, self-damaging policy for the United States. It's amazing how quickly we've lost the world. It's impressive, actually, how so few people look at the U.S. favorably, just over how it's just changed. It's just a topsy-turvy world from, 20 years ago, 10 years ago.
Right.
Okay, Dad.
No, I see with Trump, it's just that, yeah. I'll just say maybe one final comment. It's just that, okay, yeah, Trump is actually clearly has sped up the process, but the process began before him. I mean, the U.S. has been bullying countries for many years already, right? For decades, and has regarded itself as the world hegemon. But it's been, at least I think has gone about it in a maybe a more covert and more sophisticated way. It's just that Trump is just so blatant that, again, it's just like he says the quiet parts out loud. But he's not the first one to think that the U.S. can actually issue instructions and other countries have to obey. He's inheriting an attitude, but because he's Trump, he blares it out there, and he's made it much more blatant. And I think that's caused a lot of countries to wake up to the reality that's always been there.
Okay. All right, Dad. Well, let's end it there.
Okay.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day and a great weekend.
You too.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.